All right, welcome back. So in this video, we're actually going to talk about a fairly taboo topic, which is the connection between sexual energy and spiritual energy, right? So I don't know how, this is all new to me, so I don't know how YouTube feels about the word. Maybe I'll blurt some stuff out, but I'll just say it normally for now. So we're going to talk about like I said, the connection between spiritual energy and sexual energy. Because in our society, right, so there's a lot of taboo feelings about sexual energy, and we kind of have funny feelings about it, especially when it comes to being a spiritual person and a highly enlightened person, right? So just to go over this point, spiritually enlightened people very often become celibate and resist sexual thoughts and behaviors, right? And it's hard for us to even, a lot of times, if we think of someone as being very, very spiritual, right? Sometimes it's even hard to imagine them engaging in sex. If you think of like a spiritual master, right? Imagine them being highly sexualized and things like that, right? And being super into sex and wanting it all the time, right? So it's kind of hard to put the two ideas together. Why is that, right? Why do we feel that way? Where do those ideas come from? Well, this is something I thought about, and in my own experience with spiritual energy, I started to analyze this connection, and I've actually come to some interesting conclusions, right? So for years, I would kind of vacillate between different ideas about this. There actually was a time when I was like, oh, spiritual energy is completely antithetical to sexual energy, and you cannot charge both. But that doesn't seem right, right? Sex is a very natural behavior, right? How could something like that be sort of antithetical to spiritual energy, right? They should be synergistic, right? Sin is antithetical to spiritual energy. Sex isn't a sin, right? It can be, but it's not always the case that it's sinful. So that's something I've kind of thought about. Like I said, I theorize about stuff all the time. So this was just a kind of interesting sort of dynamic that I was kind of thought about a little bit. And what I learned is that as I studied it more and more, I started to come to an interesting conclusion. And to go over this, which I actually kind of put twice without realizing it, sexual emotional energy is often antithetical to spiritual energy. So, in other words, it's not always antithetical, but it is often antithetical. And that's not necessarily just when emotional energy is negative. So we didn't really talk about this that much. But many frequencies have a negative version and a positive version. So, of course, the negative version of sexual energy, which is lust, right, which we're going to talk more about that in Chapter 5, that definitely pushes spiritual energy away, right? So that has to do with when you watch, like I said, adult titles, you engage in promiscuous sex, meaningless promiscuous sex, things like that. You will absolutely feel that push spiritual energy away. But there is also a positive sexual emotional frequency, which is generally the romantic love is generally a precursor to that kind of sex, right? So if you are truly in love with someone and you have sex with them in a metaphysical reality, it's like you're forming a kind of union with them. And that's a wonderful thing. So that is very, very positive. But even then, right, it can often be antithetical to spiritual energy or have an antithetical type of behavior or effect, right? Or it can cause you to have a kind of experience where it feels like these two types of energy are antithetical to each other, right? So in this case, I'm talking about the emotional energy to the spiritual energy. So why is that? Where does that kind of antithetical nature come from? Well, it really comes from this, and this is kind of my analysis, is that the body will respond to sexual energy by trying to coerce the mind into becoming extremely needy in terms of sexual pleasure and sexual satisfaction. So basically, like I said, we haven't talked too much about it, but if you charge a lot of sexual energy, that's still an emotion, that's still a subconscious frequency, if you charge it to really high levels, right, that actually has an effect on your body, right? Like I said, your body is able to respond to frequencies, subconscious frequency, and sexual energy is a primal frequency. So it's not like other frequencies. This one is unique. It is a primal frequency. A lot of the other primal frequencies you actively try to avoid. The danger frequency is when you actually do try to get more of, that one is also antithetical to spiritual energy. But the sexual emotion you try to get a lot of, right? Because it feels good, right? But, before I go into that point, I'll just say, when you charge a huge amount of sexual energy, the parts of your body that are related to having an orgasm, right? So climaxing, they become very, 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 very sensitive as a result of that emotional energy. Excuse me. And so that charge can allow you to really have a really intense orgasm. And so the more you do it, the more you want of it, right? And the more your body, if you do it over for a prolonged period of time, your body will actually start to change in a way that allows you to have a harder and a more intense orgasm. And as you do that, I believe your brain chemistry changes too, because you're going to keep wanting more. And as you keep producing that intention of wanting more, your brain chemistry changes, right? And it charges in a way that makes you want more. So we talked about that, something similar in chapter 4. I also talked about it, chapter 6, I think. And I also talked about in the section when I talked about anxiety, about that kind of feedback loop that is possible to form between your mind and body when you both keep charging the same thing. And so what the body tends to charge your subconscious in a way at the sexual frequency, in a way that is very needy, right? So it's very needy. It's a little bit undignified, right, in terms of how badly you want something. And that neediness, right, and that indignation, right, is that the word? That sort of component of it really isn't compatible with spiritual energy. Spiritual energy makes you feel free, right? It makes you feel holy. You don't feel all this neediness when you charge spiritual energy. But the body does make you feel all that neediness, because the body is not... We'll talk more about this in chapter 5, but the body, I believe, can spiritually evolve. All of society does, right? And our bodies just aren't evolved enough to really charge sexual energy in ways that are highly positive or highly compatible with spiritual energy. We can still kind of do it if we make the effort to, right? So if I charge spiritual energy and I try to charge highly positive sexual emotional energy, or at a highly positive sexual emotional frequency, because like I said, there's a negative version, a positive version. If I charge a highly positive version of it, right, and try to do it in a way that maintains a connection with your spiritual energy, or a way that's, not antithetical to spiritual energy, I could charge both easily at the same time. I can probably do it, but then my body is going to still keep trying to get me to charge in a way that's very needy, right? And I might just give into the compulsion to charge it at the frequency my body charges it, rather than the frequency my mind is charged to charge it, which is very positive, right? So that's why I say it's often antithetical to each other. And another thing to mention is that sexual energy can be antithetical to sexual energy. Sexual energy could be antithetical to spiritual energy in a way that's not sinful, right? So they're not opposites, right? So this is something that's fairly unique, and that's what I realized, right? Normally, if something's difficult to charge with spiritual energy, usually it's sinful, right? It's not just negative emotion, it's actually sinful. But sexual energy doesn't have to be that way. There can be sinful forms of sexual energy and sinful behaviors that you engage in, but it's still an antithetical component to it even then. So if you have positive sex, let's say in marriage, and you both love each other and you're very happy, right? If you keep charging sexual energy more and more and more, because it feels so good, right? Even in marriage, right? And it's like all you want, you're going to notice that it's now harder to charge spiritual energy. Again, that's why I say having the main aspect of spirituality, I should say, is just having a relationship with God, right? It's not necessarily charging huge amounts of spiritual energy, but that's a component of it, right? And it feels really good, and there might be different reasons why you want to charge more. Usually it just feels really good to be close to God and feel, because when you charge it, you feel like you're in His presence, right? And like I said, when I get the chance, I will, as of now, I'd probably say I almost always will charge spiritual energy if I get the chance to just freely charge energy. I'm always doing so many things that I I just don't have the chance to freely use my subconscious to charge whatever I feel like. And like I said, like if I try to charge from 5 to 10 different things, I won't charge any of them very good at all. So I usually pick one thing at a time. But like I said, if you're using your subconscious to charge a lot of sexual energy because it feels good and things like that, even if it's positive, you're going to notice it's harder to charge spiritual energy. So they have an antithetical nature to each other. Now, it might be possible to do it in a way where your body changes, or your brain chemistry changes to charge a highly positive one, but I've never tried that yet, but I'm not sure if that would happen. I don't know if our bodies are, like I said, evolved enough to do that, and we'll talk about the spiritual evolution component of the body in chapter 10. But yeah, this one I wrote again, but I didn't realize I already wrote it here, so this is not important. But yeah, I just want to mention that. So if you do want to charge huge amounts of spiritual energy, then it's generally just easier to stop engaging in sex, or as much sex, right? You can still do it if it's positive. You wouldn't want to do sinful one at all, right? When you're deep charging, when you're charging spiritual energy, or deep charging it. And in terms of your relationship with God, which we'll talk about that next chapter. But as far as the positive kind, with someone you love, especially in marriage, you can still do it, of course, but if you do it a lot and you charge a lot of sexual energy, even then, you're just going to notice it's harder to charge spiritual energy. And this is why a lot of spiritual masters, people who are highly spiritual and have a strong connection to God, they just stop doing it. It's just easier, right? This is something I experienced too, right? If you want to reach the really high levels of spiritual charge, it's just easier to stop charging sexual energy altogether, to sort of avoid thinking sexual thoughts and things like that, right? And then it's much easier to reach the higher levels. And so, we'll talk more about in chapter 5. There's a lot of lust in our society, and that completely any sin really will prevent you from charging spiritual energy, but lust is basically addictive, and it's we'll talk a little more about that later, but it's addictive, and it people give into it, and it's enhanced by the body naturally, so you get that. Your body's trying to get you to do that without you even taking drugs or anything. So that really keeps people away from God. But yeah, I think I covered everything I wanted to say. It's not too long a topic, but just one I wanted to talk about. But in a nutshell, sexual emotional energy is generally antithetical to spiritual energy. And when you're deep charging spiritual energy, it's usually just easier if you're either not engaging in any sex or very little of it, right? And again, that's something I believe all spiritual masters engage in, and they've kind of come to a similar conclusion that I've come to some degree, right? And that's ultimately why we just have a hard time associating spiritual masters with sort of not with having sex in general, but it's hard for us to think of them as being highly sexualized and highly needy, right? Because that frequency isn't aligned. That comes from the body, and that neediness is not aligned with spiritual energy. When you come closer to God, you don't feel needy and like you really want to have something, right? That's like I said, and I don't know if it's undignified or indignified, but it's not a very dignified state, right, of being. When you feel close to God, you feel compulsion to behave in a way that's holy, right? This state of indignation is not holy. It's a lower frequency. In the next video, we'll also talk about something. I don't even know if I need to make a whole video of it, but I might as well. But we'll talk about the effect of shock charging spiritual energy, which that'll most likely be a very short video, but I'll just make a video to cover it. But yeah, that's it for now, though. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.